What's up, my friends? I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And when I was a kid, I used to play these games called Dynasty Warriors, where you would take on the role of these big, gigantic weapon-wielding 2nd century AD Chinese warriors. And you would run around. I'm telling you, you could use this big, long, 6-foot halberd. You could swing it around and 300 Chinese peasants would go flying, and you just try to rack up ruthless kill after ruthless kill. It's kind of dark, but also it's kind of fun. There's probably a reason that I kept playing it. There's this story woven into the whole Dynasty Warriors game, and what I eventually found out is that all of these little story bits I was getting while I played the game, it's all derived from a very famous Chinese novel called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms by a man named Luo Guanzhong. So as a young man, I set out to read them, and they were really fun and really interesting. And as I was reading this for the first time ever, in chapters that were dedicated to court intrigue and deception and politicking and backstabbing, there are these groups of guys hanging around who were called eunuchs. They were characters in imperial courts and the courts of kings who had their sexual urges suppressed either by a decision made by someone who got their hands on them when they were a kid and were like, this person is going to be dedicated to court service and we can't have them having sexual urges. We need to know that nothing's going to happen there. So they would castrate a certain class of children and dedicate them to political service in the court. Other people who served in these courts weren't made eunuchs by any decision that some adult made when they were a little baby. Other people, there was a birth defect or something went wrong. I don't know. Is it mean to say birth defect? I really want to be incredibly sensitive to people who struggle with or wrestle with identity and these issues that go along with it. Please give me grace if I'm saying that like a chump. But however someone became a eunuch, there's this very unique role in society, because what an interesting thing to have a person who is devoid of sexual interest, devoid of an interest in passing along their name or title or lands. In a way, the Song of Ice and Fire novels on which the Game of Thrones series is based accounts for this kind of thing by having a eunuch as a main character who plays this same kind of role in the court. For you and me in modern times, this just isn't a consideration that would even come around. For us, if the question of what is a eunuch or what role in society might a eunuch play were to come up, that would have much more to do with the post-1960s, maybe even post-1920s sexual liberation revolution in Western civilization. It would have more to do with issues that come up a lot in the last few years, LGBTQ plus kind of issues. And whatever you make of those issues, whatever your opinion on those things are, we just have to admit that the cultural context in which a term like eunuch comes up now is totally different than the cultural context in which that would come up in the Middle Ages or in ancient times or in Three Kingdoms era China, as I read about in that Luo Guanzhong book back in the day. But I say another time, my point in bringing up all of this background is to demonstrate how completely different the social issues that would immediately spring to mind for the audience would be for someone encountering that word in the Bible right now today versus somebody encountering that word in the 1st century AD when Jesus uses it or when it comes up in the book of Acts. And, well, let me give you the context. Here's exactly how Jesus uses it in Matthew chapter 19. We're in a showdown with the Pharisees who want to trip Jesus up, and so they come and ask him an off-the-wall question that has nothing to do with anything else that's going on at the time. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Socially unaware, it's weird. Jesus lays down his baseline understanding for gender and marriage. There is no denying, there is no point in denying that regardless of our various political preferences, proclivities, our various views of how things ought to be socially, that Jesus' expectation, the Bible expectation, the 1st century expectation that everybody had was that these were your genders, man, woman, and this is what marriage looked like. Again, grace and peace to you. If you see that differently today, that isn't my point in bringing up this text. So then they come back, the religious leaders that is, and they're like, well, how come Moses allowed people to get divorced? Jesus replies saying, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. It would be very tempting for us to say, wow, Matthew just really wanted to get in this detail about divorce and remarriage. I guess Matthew just really cared about that. He couldn't find anywhere else to shoehorn it in. So he's like, how about right there? But if we're being fair to the context, we can see that the point of the passage isn't first and foremost this teaching. The goal of Matthew is clearly not to line out a whole bunch of very specific boundary markers for what Jesus says you're allowed to get away with and what you can't. The point of this seems to be to reveal kingdom values, to reveal the work of the king, to demonstrate the invitation of the king to outsiders to become sons, daughters, heirs, agents of the kingdom, and ambassadors of the kingdom and its values. So in this situation, look, the teaching is what the teaching is, but as we talked about last time around, some sort of principle-based interpretation is going to be necessary here to think through those principles and what someone might do with it. Well, the conversation doesn't end there, and this is where we get into the eunuch thing. Verse 10, the disciple said to him, that's to Jesus, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. Jesus replied, well, not everybody can accept this word, but only those to whom it's been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way, others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Possible interpretation number one is that Jesus was anticipating the 20th century Western sexual revolutions and was trying to encode in the text some sort of affirmation or statement of empathy toward those who experience same-sex attraction or gender identity issues, dysphoria, or any of the other questions that we grapple with so much in society right now. What I can say for sure is that Jesus clearly has empathy and compassion toward people who here he's describing as eunuchs. Possible interpretation number two would be to say, man, that's a pretty broad read on what the term eunuch means. And even though I've heard a lot of possible interpretation number one from good, kind, and smart, empathetic people, I do think that there's a bit of a stretching of the historical word or term or contextual conjuring of the notion of eunuch. I think people's brains would have gone right to someone who has their sexual desires physically suppressed in such a way that they can be fully dedicated to a kingdom. It would seem here that Jesus is drawing on that court language, familiar to maybe you and I who play hack and slash video games, and familiar to the original audience because, well, eunuchs being in courts, that's a thing that they would expect and they would get it. If that's the case, then what Jesus is saying here is, yeah, it might be an ideal situation for some not to get married. Some people can't help it because somebody else made the decision for them. Somebody else might choose such an approach for their own reasons. And somebody else might say, I'm so dedicated to the kingdom that I want to be a eunuch, literally or metaphorically, as it were. So again, I don't think we're getting our answers to our burning questions about sexuality in this day and age from this passage. What I do think we're getting is an interesting insight to a much older debate that doesn't come up as much anymore. And that is, should people who are really committed to the kingdom and want to devote their lives to it become a metaphorical eunuch for the kingdom? That is, sacrifice sexual things, renounce all titles and lands like people who take the black in Game of Thrones and dedicate themselves to this entirely. It would seem that the Apostle Paul did so, and it would seem that a lot of people had a lot of questions about how this ought to work. And tomorrow I want to do a rare, extensive step aside from where we're at in Matthew to go and look at how this conversation played out through the rest of the New Testament and what the New Testament actually teaches about marriage, not so much from the perspective of how it ought to be in the debates we've had very recently, but more from the perspective of whether that is the ideal Christian life or whether there is some variety in what might be the ideal Christian life and what advantage it might be to the person who wants to be deeply devoted to the kingdom to reject marriage as a lifestyle choice for themselves. And I want to spend a little time talking about how these passages in this discussion in the New Testament has affected the unfolding of the historical church and the debate that goes on over clerical marriage and all the ramifications that come with that. Did that sound a little fancy? I think I let that sound a little fancier than I meant it to sound. Whatever the case, we're going to have fun. We're going to get after it tomorrow. Thank you again for being so dang gracious with me in public and in private as we get to difficult passages that touch nerves and get to some of the really deeply held, super personal places in people's lives. I wish everybody grace and peace, and I'm glad we get to have conversations like this. We're able to do so because of your character. Thank you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.